Well, there you are. Pull that blanket up and settle in. Get yourself comfortable now. There's no rush. It's a good night to just be still for a while. The world's still out there doing whatever it does. But that's got nothing to do with you right now. You've done enough today. More than enough, I'd wager. So let's just sit together a spell and let the evening do its thing. I've got my chamomile tonight. Made it the way I like it, which is probably a touch stronger than it ought to be. My wife had opinions about this, many opinions, across many years. And I'll say she was right about most of them, more than most. But this particular habit I've held on to. Strong chamomile, spring evening, chair by the fire. Some hills aren't worth dying on, and some are. This is mine. The windows are open for the first time since October. There's a particular quality to the air tonight. Not winter cold, not summer heavy. Just that soft, honest air that smells like something starting over. The frogs are back out there. I find I don't mind that one bit. A frog minds its own business, knows its job, shows up every spring without anyone asking. There's something to be said for that. Before we get started tonight, I'm curious about something. Tell me where you're watching from. Wherever you are, I hope the quiet's found you now. What I want to talk about tonight is something that took me the better part of a lifetime to fully understand and to stop apologizing for, which matters more than the understanding maybe. I want to talk about quiet. Not quiet as the absence of noise, though that is part of it, but quiet as a disposition, a way of moving through the world. A preference that sits so deep in the bones you don't even notice it's a preference. It just feels like the normal way to be until someone tells you it isn't. I have always been a quiet person. I think I was born that way, and I think I spent the better part of 70 years sorting out whether that was a problem or a gift. The answer, if you're wondering, is gift. But it took a while to get there. I was a quiet child. Not shy. I want to be precise about that because shy and quiet are not the same thing, and people confuse them all the time. Shy is fear. Quiet is preference. I was not afraid of people. I just didn't need them the way some children did. I was content with my own company in a way that other kids weren't, and that made adults uneasy. Teachers would say things to my mother. "He's very quiet," they'd say, in a tone of voice that suggested it was a symptom of something. And she would nod and say, "Yes, he is." And I never quite knew, standing nearby, hearing this, whether she was saying it with pride or concern. Probably both. Mothers tend to hold a lot of things at once. But here's the thing. Away from the school, away from the people asking, "What's the matter?" and "Why so quiet?" and "Cat got your tongue?" Away from all that, I was perfectly fine. More than fine. I was content in a way I didn't have words for, but I could feel it clearly, a kind of fullness that came from just being. We had a back porch, nothing remarkable about it, just a few boards, a screen door that spent most of its life in need of fixing, a couple of old chairs that had been there so long they seemed to belong to the porch more than to us. And every afternoon, after school, I would go out there. Not to do anything. That was the thing that perplexed everyone. I wasn't building something, wasn't reading, wasn't doing homework. I was just out there, sitting, sometimes watching the yard, sometimes watching the light come through the trees and change the color of things. Once I spent what must have been 45 minutes watching a beetle make its way from one end of the bottom step to the other. I have no idea where the beetle was going. Neither, I suspect, did the beetle. But it was entirely committed to the journey, and I found that admirable. My sister thought I was sulking. She'd come to the door occasionally and study me with the slightly suspicious expression that sisters reserve for behavior they don't understand. "What are you doing?" "Nothing." "Why?" I never had a satisfying answer for that. I was just out there, being out there. My mother, as I said, would look at me through the screen door with that particular look, tilted head, small frown, the look of a person trying to diagnose something. But she generally left me alone, which I appreciated more than I ever told her. I think now about that boy on the back porch, and I understand what he was doing, though I didn't have language for it then. He was resting, not sleeping. That's a different thing entirely, but resting in the way that a naturally quiet person needs to rest, and which no one around him was equipped to recognize as rest because it didn't look like anything. It just looked like sitting. But it wasn't nothing. It was replenishment. It was the quiet coming in and filling up something that the school day, the noise, the constant low-level performance of being around other people had used up. The back porch was where I got it back. That porch, over the years, became something of a private institution. I went out there in all the seasons. In summer, it was the only cool place in the late afternoon, when the kitchen held the heat of the day and nobody wanted to be inside. In autumn, it had a particular smell, leaves and the first edge of wood smoke from somewhere down the road, that I associated, and still associate, with the feeling of things settling in for the long sleep. In winter, I'd bundle up and sit out there even when I probably shouldn't have. My mother thought this was peculiar. My father thought it was eccentric. They were probably right on both counts. But there was something about the winter quiet specifically, the way cold air holds sound differently, the particular stillness of a yard under the first snow, the sense that everything had agreed to be still for a while, that I couldn't get indoors. And what I was learning out there, without knowing I was learning anything, was how to see slowly. How to look at a thing long enough that it stopped being a category, yard, tree, evening sky, and started being itself. The way a particular tree had a certain lean to it from the prevailing wind. The way the light hit the fence at 4:30 in November and lasted about 12 minutes before the color went out of it. Small things, unimportant by any practical measure, but they filled me up in a way that nothing else did, and I came inside for dinner a different kind of ready than I'd been when I went out. I think slow seeing is a form of quiet, or maybe quiet is what makes slow seeing possible. Either way, you can't do it while running. You can't do it while performing. It requires the thing that the porch gave me, stillness and time, and nobody asking you to be anything. Now, what a quiet child learns, over time, without anyone teaching it explicitly, is how to perform a little noise. How to seem louder than you are. Not dishonestly exactly, not falsely. You learn to talk when talking is expected. You learn to laugh in the right places. You learn to fill silences that other people find uncomfortable, even when the silence doesn't bother you at all. You get good at it. I got good at it. And you develop a kind of internal accounting, the quiet you owe yourself at the end of the day in exchange for all the performed noise during it. You come home and you close the door, and something in you exhales. Not because anything was wrong with the day, just because the quiet is where you live and you've been away from home for a while. I think most quiet people know what I'm talking about. The relief of a canceled plan, the particular comfort of a long drive alone, the way a quiet Sunday morning feels like an enormous gift. You don't dislike people, or at least I didn't, but you need the other thing too, the stillness, the room to yourself inside your own head. The world is not built for that, particularly. The world is largely built for the other kind of person, the one who fills a room, who makes things lively, who gets energy from the crowd rather than having it depleted by the crowd. And that's a wonderful quality. I don't say that dismissively. I genuinely admire it. I knew people who had it. My wife had something in that direction, though in her case it was warmth more than volume. She could make a person feel seen without making a single bit of noise. That's a different kind of gift entirely. But I was not that person. I was the other kind, the one finding the corner, the one watching. When I was in my 20s, young man, first real job, city apartment, the world I moved in had a very specific idea of what doing well looked like. And it involved being busy. Not just occupied, mind you, visibly, demonstrably busy. Busy in a way that suggested your time was in demand. Busy in a way that meant you were important. I had friends who ran on that, constantly moving, constantly committed to something, always in the middle of a plan or making the next one. And for a while I kept up with them. Socially, professionally, you felt the pull of it. If you weren't busy, something was wrong. If you weren't out, you were being left behind. If you were quiet, you were unambitious. And I ran that pace for a few years. Not unhappily, I want to be honest about that. There was genuine good in it. Good work, good friendships, good evenings, dinners that went late, conversations that surprised me, the specific satisfaction of a job done well in a field I cared about. I'm not going to sit here and tell you those years were a mistake, because they weren't. But underneath all of it, there was a kind of tiredness I couldn't quite account for. Not the tiredness of hard work, which has a satisfying weight to it, like a good day in a garden. This was something else, flatter, duller, harder to name. A kind of dryness, like you've been talking all day and your voice isn't hoarse, but something in you is. I didn't have words for it then. I just noticed it the way you notice weather, a persistent low pressure that you can't quite explain, but that affects how everything feels. What it was, I understand now, was a quiet deficit. A gap between the amount of stillness I was getting and the amount I actually required. Not a moral failing, not a personality flaw, just a mismatch between what the life I was living asked of me and what my particular nature needed to stay right. There was a Saturday, I must have been 26, maybe 27, when my plans fell through. Not dramatically, just the quiet unraveling of a social arrangement that didn't come together, and I found myself alone in my apartment for an entire day, with no obligations and no one expecting anything from me. And something in me, almost before I had a chance to notice it was happening, just let go. I made coffee. I sat by the window and watched the street for a while. Nothing particular happening on it, just the Saturday morning rhythms of a city neighborhood, people with dogs, a bakery getting its deliveries, someone arguing pleasantly with someone else, about nothing important. I read something, not because I had to, not for work or obligation, just because it was quiet and I felt like reading and there was time. I took a walk in the late afternoon with no destination in mind, just picked a direction and walked until I felt like turning back. Came home when I wanted to, made dinner without looking at the clock, sat with a record on the turntable. Do you remember those records? Let the music happen and watch the evening come in through the window. And by the time I went to bed that night, I want to find the right word, I felt replenished. Like something had been refilled that I hadn't quite noticed was running down. Like a thing that had been wound too tight had been allowed to go slack, and all the pieces had settled back into their right positions. And I remember lying there in the dark and thinking, with a clarity that surprised me, this is the thing, not more activity, not less activity, just this quality of day, this rate of movement, this particular relationship between the day and the self. From that point on, I started protecting the quiet. Consciously, deliberately, though I wouldn't have called it that then, I started saying no to things that were loud for the sake of being loud. I started valuing the evenings I stayed home. I started noticing when I was performing busyness, and gently, when I could, I stopped. What I found, and maybe this shouldn't have surprised me as much as it did, was that the people who actually knew me didn't mind at all. The ones who needed me louder than I was, they found their way to other people. No drama, no falling out, just a natural sorting. But the ones who knew me, who knew the version underneath the performance, they understood, or they never needed to understand because they'd never been deceived by the performance in the first place. I should say, in the interest of honesty, the sorting was not always comfortable. There were people over the years who took my quietness personally, who read it as distance or disapproval or a lack of interest in them specifically. And I understood that. I didn't resent it. When you're a quiet person and someone expects warmth to announce itself loudly, you can look like something you're not. I learned to close that gap where I could. A word here, a question there, some indication that the attention was real even if the volume was low. But I also learned not to torture myself about the cases where the gap stayed. You can only be so much of what you're not without the seams starting to show. I should mention reading, which was the other form the quiet took in my life from very early on. Books were always a form of going quiet for me, not escapism. I don't think of it that way, or at least not primarily. But a book asks you to be still. It asks you to settle. It asks you to slow your eyes down and follow something at the pace it wants to be followed. And there is something in that slowing, the particular speed of reading, which is somewhere between thinking and dreaming, that I find does the same work as sitting on the porch. It fills the quiet, or the quiet fills it. I read slowly. I always have. My wife read faster, and sometimes we'd be in the same room, both reading, and she'd finish her chapter and look up, and I'd still be 40 pages behind where I was when she started. She never said anything about this, but I caught the look once or twice. I read slowly because I'm not trying to get through. I'm trying to be there. There's a difference. And reading before sleep. I want to say something about this particularly. Reading before sleep is a way of slowing the mind down, giving it something quiet to do, something that isn't the day, isn't the problem, isn't the list, something that belongs to a different world entirely. The mind gets interested in the book and stops being so interested in itself, which is often the sticking point. And then the book starts to blur a little, and the words start swimming, and there's that particular moment when you're not quite reading anymore, but also not quite not reading, and that, in my experience, is very close to the door. My wife was in that second category. She figured out pretty quickly, I'd say within the first year of knowing me, certainly within the first year of marriage, that there were two versions of me out in the world. There was the version that showed up at dinner parties and work functions and social gatherings. That version was pleasant, was engaged, contributed to conversations, made people comfortable. It was a real version of me. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't a mask, but it wasn't the primary one. The primary one showed up on Sunday mornings. Sunday mornings in our house, as the years went on, became something sacred. Not formally. We never declared it. It just evolved the way the best arrangements do, without discussion, through accumulated preference and the quiet agreement of two people who understand each other. No television, no radio, usually, or, if there was music, something quiet, something that wasn't trying to be anything. She'd read. I'd sit by the window with my coffee and look out and not really do very much at all. The children were small for a stretch, and that made quiet harder. I won't pretend otherwise. Small children are the opposite of quiet in a way that is endearing and relentless in roughly equal measure. They fill every available space with sound and motion and need, which is exactly as it should be. That's what small children are for. But we found the pockets, early mornings, before anyone else woke up, the very end of the evening, after everyone was down, those stolen half hours. We guarded them, both of us, without ever talking about guarding them. I remember one particular Sunday. The children were teenagers by then, which means they slept till noon on Saturdays and not much better on Sundays, which is one of the genuine gifts that adolescence bestows on the household. I came downstairs in the early morning and made the coffee and sat in the kitchen in that particular pale light that happens in spring when the sun isn't quite up, but the dark is mostly gone. And I wasn't doing anything, just sitting, just being there. After a while, 20 minutes, half an hour maybe, my wife came down. She poured a cup. She sat down across from me, and we just sat there together, both of us, in the quiet, and drank our coffee and watched the light come in through the kitchen window and get gradually more serious about itself. Neither of us said anything for a good long time, not because there was nothing to say, not because anything was wrong, just because the quiet was the thing. The quiet was what we were doing. And then she said, "That's a good morning." And I said, "It is." And that was the whole of it. I've thought about that morning more than once since she's been gone. About what it meant that we could do that two people could sit together in silence for half an hour and call it good and mean it. Because that isn't nothing. That is, in my experience, one of the rarer things. There are people who find silence uncomfortable, even with the people they love most, who need the filling, the words, the movement, to feel that they are genuinely together. And I understand that. That's a real need, and there's nothing wrong with it. But for us, quiet was a form of being together, maybe the truest form. The form that required the least performance, the form in which you could be fully yourself without any effort at all. Just two people, a kitchen, some coffee, the morning happening outside the window. Nothing asked of either one, nothing needed. But anyway, where was I? Quiet in the workplace now. That's a different territory. There's an idea in professional life, and I expect it hasn't changed since my time, that the loud people are the confident ones. The ones who speak first and often, who have an answer ready before the question is fully out, who take up space at a meeting, make sure their voice is the one that carries. And I don't want to be uncharitable about this, because sometimes those people are genuinely right. Speed and confidence can be the same thing, and some situations reward the quick answer. But I also noticed over the length of a career that the people who spoke last often had the most to say. Not always, but with a frequency that was hard to ignore once you started paying attention to it. I worked with a man early in my career. I was maybe 28, 29, who I think was one of the most quietly formidable minds I ever encountered. You would not have picked him out of a room. He was unassuming in the way of deep water. Nothing about the surface announced what was underneath. In meetings, he would sit and listen while other people staked out their positions and argued their cases and took up their portions of the available air. And then, when everyone else had said their piece, sometimes well into the latter third of the meeting, when people were already mentally gathering up their papers, he would say something. Quietly, not louder than anything else that had been said. Quieter, if anything. But it would be so clearly correct, so clearly the thing that should have been said from the beginning, that accounted for everything the preceding 45 minutes had been dancing around, that the room would go still for a moment. You'd see people stop mid-thought, a kind of collective pause, while everyone quietly recalibrated. He wasn't playing a game. He wasn't waiting his turn for strategic reasons. He was genuinely listening, which is what quiet people often are when they appear to be doing nothing. He was letting all the pieces assemble before he said what they added up to. He taught me, without ever meaning to, that quiet is not a deficit. It's a practice. And you can get better at it. You can learn to trust it, to trust that the silence between the question and the answer is not empty, that something is working inside it, that the answer is forming even when it hasn't arrived yet. There's a particular patience in that, a faith in the process. After a certain age, and the age is different for everyone, I won't pretend there's a schedule. You get a kind of permission you've been quietly waiting for. You get to stop explaining yourself, not because anything has been resolved, not because the world has changed its mind about quiet people, but because you've accumulated enough years that the explaining is simply no longer expected of you. Nobody's puzzling over why you're in the corner watching. Nobody's asking what's wrong. He's old, they think. He's just being old. That's what old people do. They sit, they watch. They drink their tea at a pace that defies patience. And I will tell you, that is an unexpectedly peaceful place to arrive. Not because age is a bargain I'd recommend for its own sake, but this particular aspect of it, the permission to simply be the way you are, without apology or explanation. That part is genuinely good. Because here is the thing I know, sitting here in this chair at this hour. The quiet was always mine. It was not something I found at the end of a long road after a great deal of effort. It was there at the very beginning, on a back porch with a screen door that needed fixing, watching a beetle make its patient way across a step. It was always mine. I just needed to live long enough to stop treating it like something that required permission. But anyway, I want to try to describe something about what quiet actually gives you. Not as an argument for quiet, you're already here, you already know, but just to name it, because sometimes the things we know in our bones are worth naming. When you sit in real quiet, not the suppressed quiet of waiting for something, not the held breath quiet of a tense situation, but actual, open, unhurried quiet, the kind that isn't going anywhere. Things rise to the surface. Not always profound things, not always insights worth writing down. Sometimes it's just a memory from 30 years ago that has no particular significance, but arrives with perfect clarity. The smell of a particular room, the sound of a specific voice saying a specific thing, the quality of light on an afternoon that you hadn't thought about since it happened. Sometimes it's a small clarity about something that was troubling you without your quite knowing why. And there it is, in the quiet, obvious, and settled, where it couldn't get through during all the noise. Sometimes it's nothing at all, just a pleasant lightness, a sense of space inside yourself that the busyness had been pressing down on. What I think quiet gives you, more than anything else, is access to yourself. That sounds more philosophical than I intended. What I mean is simpler. We are not always fully present to our own lives. We're moving from one thing to the next, responding to what's immediately in front of us, performing whatever version of ourselves the situation calls for. And all of that is fine. That's just being alive, being in the world, having obligations and relationships and a job to do. I'm not criticizing the life. The life is good. But the self underneath all that movement, the self that knows what you actually think when you're not reacting, what you actually feel when you're not performing, what you actually want when nobody's asking anything of you, that self is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't fight for the floor. It waits. And if you never get quiet, if the days just accumulate one into the next without any real stillness anywhere in them, you can go quite a long time without hearing from it. I went, in my 20s and 30s, longer than I'd like to admit. Not entirely. The Sundays helped, the evenings helped, the small windows of nothing that I'd learned to protect. But I could have done better. I could have listened more carefully to the quiet version of myself and less to the one that was managing things. The quiet self is, in my experience, more accurate, more patient, more honest. It has a longer view. It knows the things that the busy, reacting, performing self hasn't had time to notice. It is also, not coincidentally, kinder to yourself and to the people around you. Something about stillness produces that. I'll give you a small example of this. There was a situation once, a falling out with someone I worked with, a disagreement that had gotten hot and stayed hot, and in the middle of it, the loud version of me was absolutely certain he was right, and the anger was righteous, and the other person was unreasonable, and it was all very clear. And then I went for a walk, a long one, and somewhere in the middle of it, somewhere past the righteous part and into the quieter part, I started to hear my own argument differently. Still right in the essentials, I thought. But there were things I hadn't considered. There were things the other person was seeing that I hadn't wanted to see. Nothing dramatic, nothing that completely upended the situation, but enough. Enough to come back and have the conversation differently than I would have otherwise, and to get to a better place than I would have otherwise. The quiet got me there, not the argument, not the stubbornness, not the loop running at 2 a.m. The walk, the quiet, the space in which the more honest version of my own thinking could get a word in. I'll say this about the modern world, just briefly. I don't want to become the kind of old man who lectures about things he doesn't fully understand, but I will say, I think noise is very available now in a way it wasn't when I was young. Not just in the sense of sound, but stimulation, information, the constant availability of something to attend to, something to respond to, something to consume. It's very easy now to go through an entire day without a single moment of quiet, without a walk where you're not also listening to something, without a meal where you're not also watching something, without even a car ride where the radio isn't filling the space. And I don't say that as a condemnation. Most of what's available is genuinely interesting. I understand the pull of it. But noise has a cost that's easy not to notice until you stop. It's like caffeine in that way. You don't know how tired you actually are until you sleep. You don't know how loud your life has been until you sit somewhere genuinely quiet and feel what settles. I have a theory, unverified, informal, the product of sitting in chairs and observing things for several decades, that the quality of a person's thinking is directly related to how much quiet they get. Not their intelligence, their thinking. The ability to follow a thought to its end, to hold two ideas next to each other and see what they add up to arrive at something true rather than just something defensible. That kind of thinking requires space. It requires a mind that isn't already full. And quiet is what makes space. Now, I used to have trouble sleeping. Not every night, but regularly for a period of years, when the work was demanding and the children were young and the financial pressures were what they were, and everything seemed to converge into one persistent weight that followed me into the night. I would lie there at 1 a.m, 2 a.m, and run the problems. You know how it goes. The mind gets hold of something unresolved, and it runs it, and runs it, and looks at it from every direction, and finds new angles to worry about it from, and runs it some more. Not productively, not toward an answer, just movement, just the grinding. And there was one night, this is a true thing, this happened, when I was lying there at somewhere around 2 a.m, having now been worrying about a particular situation for the better part of 3 weeks, and I had what I can only describe as an exhausted small revelation. The thought was this problem is going to be there in the morning. It will not have gone anywhere. And I am not, right now at 2 a.m, staring at the ceiling, solving it. I am only using up the energy I would need to solve it tomorrow. I am making myself less capable of solving the thing by staying awake worrying about it. Which means, in the most practical possible terms, I am making the problem worse. Now, a child could have told me that. There is nothing profound about the observation, but it arrived at 2 a.m. with the particular weight of a person who has been running this particular machine for 3 weeks, and it landed differently than it would have in the daytime. It landed like the floor. And I put it down. Not dramatically. There was no ceremony to it. I just decided to stop picking it up. Rolled over, started thinking about something else entirely, the creek behind my grandmother's house, for no particular reason, just that it was there, in memory, quiet and cool and unhurried. The sound of it, the smell of it in summer, the way it looked when the light came through the leaves and moved on the surface. And I went to sleep. The problem was there in the morning, same as I'd known it would be. But it looked different, smaller, more manageable. Still a problem, still requiring attention, but scaled correctly, proportioned to the daylight, rather than inflated to the 2 a.m. size things get when the mind is tired and the dark is everywhere. A rested mind is a kinder mind. I say that as a piece of actual earned bone-deep knowledge, not a prescription, not advice exactly, just something I know to be true from having lived it both ways. The night doesn't solve things, but it gives you back the capacity to solve them yourself. If you let it, if you put the day down far enough to let the night do what it does. There is a particular quality to nighttime quiet that I want to name because I think it's different from daytime quiet in a way that matters. Daytime quiet is something you make or find or protect against the noise that wants to come in. It's a clearing you tend. But nighttime quiet is different. It arrives without being summoned. The world goes quieter on its own. The traffic thins. The neighbors settle down. The particular busyness of human activity turns down its own volume. And the mind, if you've done the work of putting the day down, starts to follow. Not immediately. It takes a few minutes, the way a room takes a few minutes to cool after you've turned the heat off. But it follows. And as it does, the borders between things get a little softer. Between you and the dark, between what happened today and what might happen tomorrow, between thinking and not thinking. That's the threshold, the place right before sleep. And it is, I think, the most interesting place in the whole day, possibly the most honest. The mind is loosening its grip on the performance. The performing self is off duty. And the quiet self, the one I mentioned earlier, the one that's been waiting all day, gets a little more of the floor. That's why I think you sometimes have a good idea just before you fall asleep, or why a thing that seemed impossible at 10 in the evening suddenly seems manageable at 11. The grip loosens. The quiet self has its say. Things settle to their actual size. I've mentioned the neighbor before, the older woman with the exceptional garden. I want to come back to her for a moment because she said something once that I have turned over more times than I can count. She had a garden that stopped you when you walked past it, not because it was showy, it was actually quite restrained. Deliberate, considered, full of things that had taken years to establish. Perennials that had been there long enough to have opinions about where they wanted to be. The kind of garden that you look at and know immediately that it belongs to a patient person. I would see her out there in the early morning sometimes when I was going about my day, and what struck me was that she was always out there without any accompaniment. No radio, no earphones, nothing. Just her and the garden and whatever the morning was bringing. And she moved slowly, not because she was old and couldn't move otherwise. She was vigorous, that woman, but deliberately, as if each thing she did in the garden deserved her full attention. I asked her about it once, just passing, nothing formal. I said something like, "You always seem so quiet out here." And she looked up and thought about it for a moment, and then she said, "The garden tells you things, but it's quiet when it talks. You have to be quieter than the garden to hear it." I've thought about that a great deal. You have to be quieter than the garden to hear it. And it seems to me that this applies to most things worth hearing. The true things, the useful things, the clear things, the things that actually help, they tend to come quietly. They don't arrive on a trumpet. They come in the morning when you're sitting still with your coffee and you haven't started in on the day yet. They come on a walk when you've been moving long enough that the thinking has stopped being effortful and started being easy. They come right at the edge of sleep when the grip of the mind loosens and things that were tangled during the day suddenly aren't. You have to be quiet enough to catch them. And you can be. You can practice that. Not with any formal method, not with a program or a system. Just by giving yourself some quiet on a regular basis. A walk without earphones once in a while. A meal where you just eat the meal and don't also watch something. 10 minutes in the morning, just 10 minutes, before the day starts in on you, where you sit with your coffee and the window and nothing required. Not to think about anything in particular, not to accomplish something, just to be quiet and let things settle. Once you start doing that, once you start giving the quiet regular space, even small space, something changes. You become, gradually, harder to rattle. Not because the difficult things stop being difficult, not because the noise of the world gets quieter, but because you know where the quiet is. You know it's there, underneath everything, waiting. The noise stops feeling like the whole world and starts feeling like weather, loud today, loud maybe tomorrow, but passing. The quiet is still there underneath it. I can't tell you how much that matters over a lifetime. To know where the quiet is, to have practiced getting back to it so that when things get difficult, really difficult, the kind of difficult you didn't plan for, you don't have to find it from scratch. You know the way. I've held on to that. In genuinely hard times, I've held on to that. The quiet is still there. I'll get back to it. And I always did. There is a kind of courage in quiet that I think doesn't get enough recognition. We tend to think of courage as loud, the speech, the decision, the bold act, the courage that announces itself. And that kind of courage is real, and I'm not dismissing it. But there is another kind. I've seen it in people who, in the middle of genuinely frightening things, found a stillness in themselves that held everything together. Not frozen, not checked out, alive and still. The kind of quiet that isn't empty, but very, very full. Full of steadiness, full of presence, full of something I can only call gathered. My wife was that way at the end. I won't say too much about that tonight. It's not tonight's story, but I'll say this much. She faced what she faced with a quietness that was the most courageous thing I have ever seen in a person. She was not silent. We talked. We laughed when there was something to laugh about. We cried when that was what the moment was. But underneath all of it, there was a stillness in her that never broke. She was gathered up into herself in a way that I found, still find, thinking about it now, remarkable and a little awe-inspiring. And I've thought about where that stillness came from. I think it came from all those Sunday mornings. All the years of choosing quiet when noise would have been easier. The reading when she could have had the television on. The walks she took alone. The way she sat in a room and was simply in it, not performing, being in it. She had practiced stillness her whole life, maybe without ever calling it practice, maybe without thinking of it as anything other than just how she was. But when she needed it, when the situation asked for everything she had, it was there, deep and solid and completely hers. You don't practice quiet like you practice a skill for a test. You practice it by living quietly when you can, by choosing the walk over the television, by sitting with the morning instead of immediately filling it, by letting the evening come in slowly instead of rushing it out. And then, when you need the quiet, really need it, when the stakes are real and the difficulty is genuine, it's there, because it was always there. You just kept the door open. I find myself, at this age, genuinely grateful for the disposition I was born with. Grateful for the boy on the back porch who knew what he needed and went and got it, even without language for it. Grateful that his mother, whatever her private concerns, generally left him to it. Grateful for the Sunday mornings that became a kind of institution, for the pockets of quiet in the middle of the busy years, for the evenings home instead of out. Grateful for the neighbor who was quieter than her garden and heard what it had to say. Grateful for the man at work who waited until the end and said the right thing quietly. Grateful for my wife, who never needed me to be louder than I was, who knew the primary version and preferred it, who sat across from me in the kitchen one Sunday morning without a word for half an hour and called it a good morning. Grateful for a whole life of small, quiet things. The corner of the library that was always empty on Tuesday afternoons, the particular bench in the park that faced away from the path and toward the water, the long drives home from places where nobody expected conversation for a while, the hundreds of small mercies of quiet accumulated over a long life. You don't notice them as they happen. Each one seems slight, dispensable, unremarkable. But they add up. Looking back, they add up to something substantial, something you can feel in the bones, a life that was, underneath all its noise and obligation and difficulty and joy, a peaceful life. And grateful for evenings like this one. The spring air in through the window, the frogs doing their job, the fire settling down to its easier, quieter self, the chamomile, the lamp, the particular satisfaction of nowhere to be and nothing required. I hope you have your version of this. I hope somewhere in your life there is a place, a chair, a porch, a corner of a room, a particular time of day, where the quiet finds you and you let it. Where you don't have to perform anything, where you can be the primary version of yourself for a while without apology. And if you haven't quite found it yet, well, you're working on it. This, right here, is working on it. Lying down in the dark and choosing stillness instead of spinning, putting the day down instead of carrying it into the night, letting the quiet do what it does when it has room to do it. That is not nothing. That is a practice, and it gets easier. Each time you do it, it gets a little easier. Each time you choose the quiet, you're making it a little more yours. The quiet was always there. It belongs to you. It always did. You're just remembering that. And right now, something in you knows it. The breath is settling. The day is getting a little further away. The lists, the worries, the open loops, they're still there somewhere, but they're not yours tonight. Tonight, they can wait. You're in the quiet now, let it have you. You know, there's something I want to say to the people who come back here regularly, who make a habit of this, who have, without necessarily thinking of it in these terms, built a kind of quiet practice out of an old man telling slow stories at the end of the day. You're doing something real. It might seem passive. It might seem like nothing, lying down, listening, drifting off. But you're training something. You're training the part of yourself that knows how to stop, the part that can hear the quiet approaching and move toward it instead of away from it, the part that can put the day down and trust the night. That gets easier over time. It does. The first time you try to be still, the mind runs. It has things to say. It has places it would rather be. But the 10th time, the 50th time, you start to recognize the feeling. You know what's coming. And there's something in you that's genuinely glad. That's the practice. Small and quiet and done in the dark. Nobody sees it. Nobody gives you credit for it. But it's building something in you that is going to help you, not just tonight, not just with sleep, but with the whole broad shape of how you move through the world. A person who knows where the quiet is and knows how to get back to it has something. Something useful and real and entirely their own. You're getting that. One evening at a time. And I suppose the quiet asks nothing of you, really? That's the thing about it. Most things want something from you. Most things require effort, attention, maintenance. They need you to show up correctly. But the quiet just waits. Patient as a garden, patient as a creek in August. It was there before you knew what to do with it. It'll be there after you've stopped worrying about whether you're doing it right. It doesn't need you to be impressive in it. It doesn't need you to be anything. Just still. And that you can do. You're doing it now. Just let the rest of it go. Whatever's on the list, whatever's unresolved, it'll keep. The night has a way of taking care of the rest. Well, that's about all from me tonight. You just close your eyes now. Don't worry about what's coming tomorrow. It'll sort itself out, same as it always does. You did good today. Sweet dreams now. I'll be right here.